Welcome back, everyone, here to Full Circle, Florida. It was a big week of news, so let's get right into our panel discussion this week. And joining me here this week, Janelle Irwin Taylor, the publisher of Southeast Politics, and of course, our political analyst, Dr. Susan MacManus, back here with us. All right, so let's start with something I noticed this week. There could not have been a more immediate and relevant example of something I've been trying to hone in on this show for a while now. The politics of needs versus the politics of wants. South Florida underwater. I-95 shut down, cars floating away. People were afraid in their own homes with all the rush of water they were getting. The storm blew up quickly. Meanwhile, culture wars making headlines in Florida again this week. The federal court striking down Governor DeSantis' ban on gender transition therapy. The governor says he's going to appeal. I'm just curious, are culture wars a luxury in a state where we clearly have some pretty pressing needs when it comes to infrastructure?
You know, I don't know that luxury is the best word for it. I think in a state like Florida that has, to many of us, become truly a red state now, I think it's a way of solidifying the base for the Republican Party. It fires them up. Fear sells much better than hope. Yeah. So, you know, I think the thought process is why not both? You can address the flooding and things like that and still scare the crap out of people to vote the way you want them to vote.
If your home is flooded, are you thinking red and blue, or are you thinking just fix this?
You're thinking this is a huge, unpredicted storm. Look across the country. You got fires, you got tornadoes, you got hurricanes here, or storms. The bottom line is these emergencies or natural disasters are on the upswing. There's a number of states right now that have had a similar problem. We're having water, others have another. Begging Congress to come up with a better funded emergency fund, because no matter what they spend, they couldn't fix all those problems in South Florida.
FEMA's apparently short on money right now, so hopefully Congress fixed that. The Hunter Biden verdict, guilty as we know. So if you're keeping score at home, that's one for Trump, one for Biden. Does anyone care about this?
Well, it's 34 for Trump and 3 for Biden, so there's that.
Who's counting?
And I don't think that it's going to make a huge difference in people's voting patterns. I think that partisan voters have already made up their minds, and nothing that happens in the courts is going to change that. And I think middle of the road voters just don't know what to think, so they're paying attention to the economy and what's happening at their kitchen tables and in their own wallets, and things that are happening in courtrooms doesn't really rise to the level of swaying their opinion. So I don't think it's really going to matter in the
fall on deaf ears, Susan?
It's been that way for so long, and the problem right now is that there's starting to be a lack of confidence in the courts all over the country. Secondly, I think these haven't really affected the outcome of how the polls, but maybe sentencing will.
Okay, yeah, that's a whole new arena that could play out. Russia in the news this week got a little too close for comfort. Russian subs passing by Florida, parked in Cuba, show of force. Then Biden announces this 10-year-long security deal with Ukraine, so I guess they're getting a blank check for the next decade. Where do you think we're headed with this? How big of this issue on foreign policy will that play in this election, or is this a domestic kind of election?
Depends on the generation. Older voters are very national security oriented. The Cuba problem is very, very scary because of the proximity geographically to us. Ukraine is the younger people's issue. It will affect some people's votes.
Memories of the Cuban Missile Crisis for people who lived in Florida.
Exactly, and I think this is also a situation where Biden is kind of, you know, he doesn't really have a lot of good options here, because if he does what he did with the 10-year situation, that, you know, he's going to make a lot of people angry at the spending that comes along with that. And then if he hadn't, he's going to anger people who worry that he's not doing enough for national security.
Speaking of national security, ISIS in America this week, 8 suspected terrorists with ties to ISIS not only crossed the border, they were living here, they've been arrested. But one New York City councilman who happens to be a Democrat said, quote, "We are headed for another 9/11. So Republicans and Democrats, at least in tone, sounding similar these days. Hypocrisy aside on that, this is happening on Biden's watch. If just one, even if it's a minor terrorist attack, happens, is that lights out for his campaign?
Almost lights out. You never say never, but I'd say certainly it looks like it could be.
I wouldn't call it hypocrisy. I mean, Republicans do not corner the market on national security. I think they like to, or homeland security. I think they like to pretend that they do.
They could have done something.
But exactly, it's not just Democrats here. So, I mean, the fact that they're calling for things to make sure that that doesn't happen, that's something that both parties should be doing and shouldn't really be a partisan issue.
Both parties had an opportunity to pass significant immigration reform, and they punted the ball because they want it to be an election issue. Is that
It's like
fair
the
to say?
economy, the person in charge, the chief
Yeah.
president, takes the credit when it's great and the blame when it's bad.
Well, another major development this week, the Supreme Court ruling unanimously to preserve access to the abortion pill, which most abortions are done now via that medication. I'm genuinely curious, does that decision by the Supreme Court take the energy out of voters who might have been wanting to show up to the polls in this election to vote on abortion, essentially, as a referendum via the presidency? Thoughts on that?
Absolutely not. And here's why. So the abortion pill can only be used up to a certain point. So when you're talking about women who are facing tragic circumstances, the fetus won't survive outside of the womb, for example, the abortion pill is not going to help with that. So if you're a woman facing that tragic circumstance in a state like Louisiana or Alabama, you have no recourse. So those voters are still going to be very, very motivated.
This was not the final end-all be-all for abortion.
The good news was it was unanimous, but of course, Democrats are convinced that this is their issue to get back to the White House.
Which is short-sighted.
Right, because, well, when we've talked about this before, Susan, that issue is not necessarily purely Democratic, purely Republican, purely liberal, purely conservative. There's some crossover there. The Supreme Court also made another decision on bump stock bans. Interestingly enough, that was a Trump ban. And I want your thoughts on that. Also, you know, the decisions that are made by the Supreme Court recently are big and defining. Does the Supreme Court have too much power?
No. No, we need the Supreme Court. I mean, you can make arguments about the partisan lean of this Supreme Court or any previous Supreme Court being too conservative or too liberal, but that system of checks and balances is what this country was founded on, and it is crucial to ensure that there is never too much government.
But doesn't it lack transparency? Are these 9 people that put on these robes, they're not magic wizards that know everything, right?
That's a different question. Of course, there can always be more transparency, especially if you're somebody like me who runs a news organization, but
well, guns as an issue is certainly among the top 5 or 6, and gun-related issues can certainly elevate that issue, and depends on where we are in the election cycle, but it will be something that will be reignited, and I think particularly among younger voters.
Okay, so the Supreme Court, it's there for a reason. You don't vote them in, but elections have consequences, and that's what we're seeing on full scale.
Yes, I mean, in 2016, there were numerous warnings to people who were, you know, the quote-unquote Bernie bros.
Yeah.
That, you know, if you have a protest vote, Donald Trump is going to wind up with a bunch of Supreme Court nominees, and that's exactly what happened.
Another reason to vote. All right, thank you, panel. Thank you for staying with us, and Full Circle Florida continues right after this.